In today's society of modern martial arts, kata seems to be a bad word because it's attributed to the classical abstract forms that are done in classical styles. The truth of the matter is, if you understand what kata is, you'll see that all forms of martial arts do it. Stay tuned. We'll talk about it. Welcome to Shihan's Dojo. I'm Shihan Marty Husband, and I'm here today to help you build your martial arts skill and knowledge, or if you're wanting to learn a little bit more about the martial arts, tell you a little bit more about it. So if you're here for the first time, jab that subscribe button and punch the bell so we can notify you when we have a new video coming out. Question for today is, what are your thoughts where kata is used in your martial arts system? Let us know in the comments down there so we can possibly get a discussion going and go further in depth in what we think kata is. As was stated, when we think of kata, most people think of the classical forms of martial arts that are done, whether in tournaments, for tests, or just as a training aid for most of the classical styles. Many of these classical stylized forms have been around in some variation over the past few hundred years. Often these katas are considered useless by many of the mainstream martial artists out there today who feel that it's just outdated. In reality, they just don't understand the actual purpose for the kata. The problem with that type of thinking is that if you're in the martial arts, you're actually doing kata all the time. The word kata actually means in Japanese, according to what someone has learned before you and is trying to pass it down to you. Some people make the mistake of not understanding the translation because our English language or Latin-based languages tend to be a little bit more limited in some ways. So they really miss what the translation is standing for. Even I have my problems trying to understand languages and have to constantly look them up to make sure I'm completely understanding what I am trying to accomplish with my limited vocabulary. I will not go into the classical martial arts today to understand kata. That would defeat the whole purpose of this video. What I am going to talk to you about is what I think kata really is, whether you're in UFC, MMA, boxing, fencing, classical martial arts, football, and baseball use all forms of kata. Let's use pitching as an example. There are many types of pitches that a pitcher can control, from sliders to curveballs to knuckleballs to fastballs. It could go on. And in each of these, there's something that's basically attributed to each of those throws. Even in the big leagues, some pitchers cannot throw all of the different types of pitches that there are, but they focus on becoming good at the pitches that they can throw physically and mentally. If they were left to their own device, a person might be able to figure out how to do all the types of pitches that they're good at. However, that's where coaching comes in. Without proper coaching, the pitcher would take a lot longer in doing it and probably be too old to pitch in a major league game by the time he figured it all out. So in coaching, someone has to come up with the basic drills and the premise of what they're trying to do when they handle that ball. This includes proper fingering, torquing, hip action, and the general types of control that is needed for that. It's the same way if you're doing martial arts, say like boxing. They teach you how to punch and jab, cross, and defend yourself to keep from getting hurt when you are going to fight. These drills and exercises would be taught to you over and over again until they become ingrained in your movements and actions to build up the necessary reflex, muscle memory, and how to apply them properly. In classical martial arts, originally kata was done by two people. This was used to test out the techniques in practice and understanding how to apply what they were doing in their actions. This is still common in judo, jiu-jitsu, several other different martial arts like kempo, some Chinese martial arts, even in Okinawan karate, wrestling, and boxing. The main idea of doing kata individually came later as the teacher began to realize that the techniques were so vast it was hard to teach everything at once, especially the important ones. So they basically developed a pattern using those movements in order to understand them better. I did something called kwon, and that's the type of system that they used in order to develop those katas. This would help to build up those body actions and make sure they weren't forgotten. Now, mind you, they've been changed down over the years, but that's another discussion for another time. There's another theory I kind of agree with, put out there by Patrick McCarthy, who stated that he felt that it was done by the habitual acts of physical violence that was done. Some people refer to this as HAP-V. This basically utilized the types of unarmed combats that would often be seen with the peasants or the normal people that weren't in the courts. But it didn't stop there. We even see it in martial arts weapons that are used, and even in the European weapons in fighting that they had set it up that way. I have looked over many books from the Renaissance Renaissance period that taught fighting and how to do it throughout Europe. It was done so that all fighters and soldiers knew exactly what was being requested of them when they were done. These techniques were basically built around the fact that they worked in actual combat. The bad thing was it did stagnate many of the soldiers from being able to think for themselves, because they really didn't have the intellectual knowledge to break down these techniques and examine them for themselves. In situations where a person could break them down and actually change them or build on what they'd learned, they usually became the top-notch fighters and were often recognized that way as examples. In essence, these tactics and strategies were basically the ideals that formed, as you could say, a kata there. Hopefully we'll cover some of these principles in a later video, and I do plan on one coming up here real soon. But let's understand how kata applies with the technique. The first thing we're going to talk about, as I mentioned, was the breakdown of the technique. The Japanese often referred to this as bunkai, and any classical practitioner will usually break down the premises of each of these movements that are done in the katas that they perform to become well acquainted with the movements and actions they're doing when they perform them. Without the breakdown of the techniques, many of these actions become single-sided and are only seen for one or two purposes, with the reality of not knowing what the original purpose was. The examination of any techniques, whether it's kata, whether it's training drills that you're doing, your basic experience has to break down and surmise what this technique is being used in order to change it for different types of tactics or strategies you might be trying to build upon. So this is the basic groundwork for any kind of kata or according to purpose. When people are taught these according to, they are given the breakdown of what that movement's about according to that person teaching it, or sometimes according to what that level needs to learn. There are a lot of things that can be broken down when you're trying to study the bunkai of your technique. Remember, at one time, these bunkai were very personal for somebody who figured out how to use them efficiently and effectively. The second part is analyzing the technique you just broke down. The Japanese also refer to this as bunseki. This takes that from that single-sided nature that we talked about and puts a generalized purpose to build upon the different possible uses or applications to the things that were not originally thought of for that kata or set of techniques, and build upon the strategy and tactics that we're trying to incorporate into these different actions and get to the goal we're trying to accomplish. I use a system I call TAP to analyze my own techniques. You can click it up here at the top if you want and go to it. It's one of my first videos, so the quality isn't as good as they are now, but the information is very useful if you want to understand that process. The third part is actually applying the technique. And when I say actually applying the technique, I mean in a way not generally taught. This is sometimes referred to as oyo in Japanese. This involves making sure you have a good partner, or partners depending on what you're trying to accomplish with it, where you can both break down these techniques to understand them. It is used to see how they would be applied in those situations, and, if possible, understand when they won't work in certain situations. This type of training requires that you keep your ego in check, because just because your technique looks pretty, if it doesn't work, you can't use it, and you don't. Not in the application you're trying to do. In keeping with that type of application, you can better distill each of these techniques and see how they can be formulated to handle any type of self-defense situation or sparring situation, depending on where you're going with this. Now, I know there are several people out there who are going to say Bruce Lee said kata was useless. Understand one thing. Bruce Lee did start out with katas. He also learned techniques from many different styles and applied them to his own because he understood, according to the practice of his technique, what a real kata was. What I took from him was the fact that most classical styles tend not to let the student use too much variations at a lower rank in order to make sure everybody's doing the same thing. So the students have to blindly follow somebody for a long time. Now, the problem is, many of these martial artists that were taught classical styles often had the same problems with the instructors that were teaching it. They wouldn't allow you to do anything different or think for yourselves. They expected you to listen and do exactly what they say without actually teaching you how to apply everything. And I think in the beginning, it does help to prevent any confusion with what's going on. People know basically how to apply something. And if they want to further get into their studies, they can then start breaking it down as they get more advanced. I think many techniques were lost in understanding from the classical karate, as well as many of the techniques that were done in the past. However, these three principles of bunkai, bunseki, and oyo have always been prevalent. It doesn't matter whether it's Asian martial arts or European fight. In studying the older forms, you have to also remember that karate was meant to evolve. Sometimes we evolve our styles so far that we actually lose what the importance was of those techniques. So we do have to maintain that and keep it, because it could be important for somebody else besides you. It's just understanding what really kata is doing for a martial artist. So if you think you don't want to do kata, quit doing your jabs. Quit doing your jab reverse punch combinations. Quit doing your blocking, because that's kata. And whether you like it or not, if you don't train that way, you'll not be able to perform the proper movements or techniques when the time comes. In the future, I hope to share some of my ideals and thoughts about kata that I've been able to pull from the various forms I've studied over the years. Some of you out there are probably throwing your hands up in the air and said, oh great, another kata person. But I see kata in every training drill or exercise that is done. Now I hope this has been some help to you, and if you like this video, press like down there. Share it with your friends or other martial artists that you know. That way we can help to build Shihan's Dojo. And don't forget to answer the question of the day. What are your thoughts on where your kata is used in your style? Leave it in the comments and any other questions you might have down there. And we'll try to get back to you just as soon as possible. We hope to see you again here on Shihan's Dojo.